There's been no shortage of sandbox games since the dawn of the generation. Franchises which were usually home to linear, story-driven titles suddenly became these sandbox behemoths, while the established giants of the genre like Rockstar continued to deliver the deepest maps on the market. Of course, with so many open-world games being created, it was inevitable that a good chunk would fall a little short. What's often the most disappointing part of getting a bad open world game isn't just repetitive game design or a lifeless story though. Oh, no, it's when the sandbox itself is beautifully detailed, but the gameplay just doesn't do it justice. You can tell that the artists spent countless hours to painstakingly recreate iconic cities or come up with their own imaginative locations, only to have all that effort completely wasted on games which players just didn't want to stick with. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 incredible open worlds wasted on disappointing video games. Number 10, Paris, Assassin's Creed Unity. Although they righted the ship now, it shouldn't be underestimated just how much of a disaster Assassin's Creed Unity was for Ubisoft's premier franchise. The game buckled under its own ambition to have city streets littered with NPCs, with the strain its huge, dense world put on the game engine, resulting in a title full of bugs and faces that melted straight off characters' skulls. But one thing which did remain intact during this broken launch was the gorgeous recreation of French Revolution-era Paris. The attention to detail, just like in most Assassin's Creed games, was astonishing, with both the massive exteriors and interiors holding up under scrutiny. The architecture of the time is of course the biggest highlight, and it was still awesome to climb to the highest peak and sit in wonder at what the artists had created. Unity's vision of highly populated cities was noble, and it's a shame that the final product didn't have the power to support it. Number 9, Medici, Just Cause 3. While a lot of developers have moved away from the bigger is better mentality in recent years, there are still a bunch desperate to hold the title of having the largest sandbox any game has ever seen. Just Cause 3 was one of these games, and when it released back in 2015, was essentially built around the idea of being the most open world game, with its map of Medici coming in at a whopping 400 square miles. It's not the most detailed place in the world, but the vibrancy of the islands with the lush greenery complementing the striking blue ocean made every action in the game picturesque. In a way, it kinda made you feel a little bad that you were blowing the whole thing to smithereens. Just Cause 3 can be a lot of fun, but it undoubtedly suffered at launch thanks to an engine that struggled to keep up with the scale of the action. To say the frame rate was unstable would be polite, and even after plenty of patches, there was the feeling that the sequel wasn't as polished as it could have been. Number 8, Chicago, Watch Dogs. It was difficult to properly analyze Watch Dogs' visuals at launch, because no matter how good they may have been at the time, they were inevitably compared to those impossibly beautiful pre-release trailers. Consequently, its open-world version of Chicago was criticized for not being as picturesque and dynamic as it was supposed to be, even though it was a damn fine playground to hack your way through. Chicago is an interesting city in media, as while it doubles for a lot of places in movies, for instance Gotham City in Batman Begins, it rarely ever shows up as itself. The team at Ubisoft more than did it justice though, creating a modern metropolis faithful to the actual city. There was also this cool new feature that made it look like buildings had interiors, which, trust me, blew everyone's minds back when this game came out. It's admittedly not as detailed and exciting to explore as the second game's version of San Francisco, but it still deserves lots more love. Number 7, New Bordeaux Mafia 3. Mafia 3 could have been something special. All the cards were lined up. You had a great protagonist in Lincoln Clay, an emotionally affecting plot, a brilliant socio-political climate to mine, and, of course, a lifelike world to explore in New Bordeaux. Unfortunately, while all of those features can be appreciated in isolation, the repetitive mission design the game is lumped with completely stops you appreciating the sequel as a full package. Essentially a stand-in for New Orleans, New Bordeaux provided a great dichotomy between the city streets and the nearby swampland, which were, of course, full of alligators that could handily dispose of bodies for you. However, it was the vintage late 60s setting that made it something special, with period-authentic architecture and iconography littering the map to give it such a distinct, unique look and atmosphere. It's not part of the open world, but the pitch-perfect soundtrack cruising down the streets to Eve of Destruction, for instance, definitely didn't hurt either. Number 6, Postapocalyptic Earth, Rage. The gaming world is not in need of any more post-apocalyptic sandbox games. By now, the setting is about as overdone as zombies are enemies, but back in 2011, it was actually a rarity. Sure, you had Fallout 3 opting for a semi-realistic version of a bombed-out Washington, D.C., but there was little else in the AAA space at the time. In came id Software's Rage, a first-person shooter set in a post-apocalyptic version of Earth that had been destroyed after colliding with an asteroid. The design itself was more alien than realistic, focused on scorched deserts and shantytown outposts. It was cool, and it was definitely not like Mad Max. Why would you ever bring such a thing up? I mean, look, it's definitely not copying Mad Max. I mean, honest, they don't even know what Mad Max is. The most important thing Rage actually did, though, was making this sandbox feel like a place where humanity was actually trying to rebuild. Sure, it looked a little bit like, other movies and games, but that didn't matter, because the developers made you believe this place could actually exist. It's just a shame the shooting itself was completely lifeless. Number 5, the Andromeda Galaxy, Mass Effect Andromeda. With Mass Effect Andromeda, BioWare had free reign to go absolutely nuts in coming up with whatever crazy designs the minds of their artists had to offer. Worlds that would make H.P. Lovecraft weep, architecture not made for humans, aliens made entirely of testicles or something, I don't know, anything. They could have gone mad. The options were limitless, but sadly, for the most part, the Andromeda system was full of the same sci-fi iconography fans had been subjected to for years. Still, the distinct planets you could land on were fun to explore, especially with the weird environmental problems each one came with. Crashing down on these uncharted planets and figuring out a way to make them hospitable really made you feel like a proper explorer, out on your own and discovering things no human had ever laid eyes on before. That loop could have been the focus of a whole game, but as it stands, it's obfuscated by a pretty terrible plot and side missions that make you feel less like an adventurer and more like somebody's personal assistant. Number 4, the entire USA, the crew. America has, understandably so, always been present in video games. Usually devs will pick one iconic city and attempt to bring it to life. Let's face it, it's usually New York, but the crew decided to go one step further. Rather than settle for a single city or even a single state, the racer would cram the entirety of the USA into a single game's map. Ubisoft's ambition was certainly gigantic, but the most surprising thing was that they actually accomplished what they set out to create. While of course it wasn't a one-to-one recreation of the country, driving from city to city and state to state was a joy. Taking a cool drive from LA to New York, for instance, felt like an actual road trip, as even bombing down streets at over 100 miles per hour would result in it taking well over 30 minutes to get from one city to the next. Detail was sometimes lacking, but it was still impressive to travel around and see the sights. Sadly, Ubisoft gave players very little incentive to do so, as the actual races themselves weren't all that enjoyable, and even with other players being visible, the experience was kinda lonely. Number 3, 20th century London, Vampire. Late 1800s/early 1900s London has been represented in video game form a couple of times this generation, between Assassin's Creed Syndicate and Vampire, and frustratingly, both times it hasn't been done justice. It's perhaps the latter title which feels like the biggest missed opportunity though. The supernatural RPG from Dontnod certainly showed promise, but it was far too unrefined to break out of its little niche audience of die-hard fans, even in spite of its haunting early 20th century setting. With the dense streets being torn apart by the Spanish flu, Vampire had the perfect backdrop to tell its horror tale, but while London itself was awesome to explore and awarded the game with such rich atmosphere, that's pretty much all it had going for it. It's still worth picking up for the period setting alone, but you won't escape the feeling that the devs could have done so much more with it. Number 2, Appalachia Fallout 76. If there's one word to describe Fallout 76 that isn't broken anyway, it's uninspired. From the design of the missions to the loot to the mere fact that it's a games as service title, the release is devoid of any real creativity. However, that same apathy towards imagination thankfully didn't extend to the setting, Appalachia. Unlike most sandboxes in this franchise, Appalachia is unique in how it actually wasn't destroyed by the nuclear apocalypse. Instead of being bombed, it was simply ravished by radiation, meaning that most of the buildings are left intact, only completely empty and devoid of human life. Not only does this award the game with a particularly eerie quality, but it makes the player feel like they're rediscovering a lost relic, the remains of a time gone by that juxtaposes with just how dead the world actually is. There's so much variation to the map as well, it's just a shame that it's all undone by bugs and glitches that take almost everything away from what intrigue this setting could have held. Nope, I am not still bitter. Why do you ask? Number 1, Manhattan: The Division. As mentioned previously, there have been plenty of video games that have used New York City as their setting. From every single Spider-Man title ever made to Grand Theft Auto to Crysis 3, the Big Apple has been imagined and reimagined countless times in video game form, but never as well as in The Division. The dystopian shooter might have had uninspired gameplay, but its desolate version of NYC, abandoned one Black Friday and still decked out in Christmas lights and decorations, is haunting. There's something so creepy about the city being so desolate, not destroyed or decaying like in other post-apocalyptic media, simply empty. It helped that the developers managed a one-to-one recreation of part of Manhattan as well, which really captured the scale of the location. It's not that the map itself simply felt large, it was more that the player was made to feel small, as they were surrounded by these winding streets and impossibly high skyscrapers. It was easily the best part of that original game, and it's a shame that it's been chucked out entirely for the sequel, especially because you could have brought in other boroughs of NYC to make the game world even bigger. So that's our list. I don't know what you guys think down in the comments below. Do you agree that these open worlds were wasted, and would you like to see more of them? And which ones have I missed here? Either way, while you're down there, can you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.